are insane.
Okay, let's play some
God fucking damn shit. Sources about who was healed. She hears a rumor, and in her desperation, she goes out after it. And again, there's no reason to believe she won't do that exact thing for any other rumor. This is the example that is to be put before us as something beautiful. That's not trust at all. Nothing about that has anything to do with trust. That's survival behavior. It honestly made me think, have you ever seen some of those videos where an animal is in trouble, an animal that's usually super skittish, like a deer maybe, but their young is caught in a trap, or they've been without water forever, and it's that final moment where all of a sudden the human is videoing them, oh look at this sweet little deer who's trusting me, I got it some water. That deer would be anywhere other than you if it had any other choice. It's not a beautiful act of submission. It is survival desperation. And here's an uncomfortable question. Why does this woman need faith at all? Is God not good and just and in control? Why does his power have to be stolen from him? Why do others have to beg him? Why does God always have to be asked to do the right thing? I mean, that's what prayer is. Christians petitioning God to do the things he already says he supposedly desires for and wants to do. But not if you don't ask me, and in just the right way, with just enough desperation that all call faith and then call that beautiful. The reframing is insane. No, this is a God who essentially tortured her for 12 years, who designed a system where healing is withheld until desperation peaks. Faith doesn't seem like a solution here. It seems like a symptom here.
God damn it.
It's true enough today. We see it all the time. Faith is not required when medicine is working. You need no faith when you get a cancer diagnosis and a doctor lays out a treatment plan and you do the treatment and you're healed. You might have prayed along the way, and you'll probably still then give credit to God over the doctors. But it's when the chemo is not touching it. It's when it comes back. It's when you ran out of money to keep fighting this thing. Then all of a sudden, the faith is everywhere.
Dumbass!
The church testimonies go up. Always a last resort. And I don't blame you. Oh my gosh, I've never been in that dire of a situation. If the doctor says there's nothing more we can do, or a child is dying, or when addiction has hollowed out everything, when control, whatever semblance you have of it, is completely collapsed, and grief just overwhelms you, and you get down on your hands and knees, and there's nothing left to do. I would never judge anybody for hoping, for trying anything. We can have a whole conversation about atheists and foxholes. It's not exactly the same thing, and there's plenty of atheists in plenty of foxholes. But I'm not knocking an atheist or a believer or someone of a different religion for in utter hopelessness or desperation saying, trying, or doing anything. It doesn't matter how obvious it is when you're falling off that building, you're still grabbing at something. That doesn't make you a weak person, it makes you a desperate person. And so I think then that proves that faith is not beautiful, it's desperation. And that would be fine again if it was positioned that way, but it's not. It is this faith first kind of idea that that's the design, that that's what God wants, that that's what's most pleasing, that that's what's most beautiful, that that's when you're going to get what you want, that's when the healing comes, that's the hierarchy of belief, that's the right way to believe. We'll accept others, but remember, childlike and without evidence, that's what we want. And really, faith just exploits this. Like all of human psychology that we know about. We've talked about so many things. I've talked on this channel here before about explanation addiction, that we have such a huge desire for anything to make sense in some way, to give it a narrative, to give it a story, to give it agency, to have a reason, some intention. We don't want it to be random, and we don't want it to be unknown. We're wired to detect agency, to complete patterns, and to assume intention behind events. Again, wiring that evolved for survival, not for accuracy. And yeah, faith is exploiting that.
God damn it.
Hyperactivity,
God fucking damn it.
Detection, that fear of randomness, that uncomfortability with I don't know, that there's no other options left. Well, there's only one. Have you prayed about it? Have you begged God? Have you gotten down on your hands and knees? And it's the first thing that's blamed when all the things God promises to do, like communicate with you, show up, heal, answer prayers. When those things don't happen, ye have little faith, the same chastisement that Jesus gave to his followers. If faith had any connection to truth, it would be way more steady. It wouldn't have to be via desperation and a last resort. Truth isn't contingent on those kinds of things, but faith sure seems to be. And why then does faith decrease with things like education, stability, security, wealth? But it spikes in poverty and war and illness. I mean, it's just actually quite obvious. And then I started thinking of all the other biblical examples, all the things that should be good or desired for humans, but get replaced with faith. I think about the story of Job, and after everything is taken from him, and everyone he knows and loves is turned on him, it is only in his absolute moment of total and utter brokenness, when he no longer can even question God, and he hangs his head to give in to the tyrant bully that has tortured him and killed his children. Then he's praised for his faith. You know what faith
You
replaced in the
stupid
story of Job?
goddamn
Justice.
motherfucker.
There was no justice there. Job was a righteous man. Even God admits that he was essentially talked into by the adversary going after Job for no reason. That's not
Alright,
justice.
fuck his.
That's not even
Oh,
justice. That's
goddamn
injustice. And the
motherfucker.
only way to overcome
Shit.
that for a God
Suck
who
my
can never
dick.
have a shortcoming is to say, you need
Stupid
faith.
fucker.
His ways are higher. He's such a mystery. Who are you to question him? So faith replaces
Now fuck up and
justice.
overlook this right
For the
here.
hemorrhaging
I can
woman,
stick
it
my
replaced
dick in your fucking...
options. Nothing else
You
to do,
suck my
nothing else to
motherfucking
try.
dick, bitch.
Might as well. For Abraham, who was ready to kill his son, it replaced
Stupid!
critical thinking,
Stupid,
his
stupid, stupid,
conscience,
stupid,
whatever you
stupid,
want to say.
stupid, stupid,
Its
stupid,
morality.
stupid.
With
Stupid
the
machine,
centurion,
I
it
just almost something
replaces
the fuck out of
evidence.
you.
It does that a lot, by the way. Oh, no good reason to believe in God? Just do it anyways. For the
Suck
blind man
my
I was talking about, it
motherfucking dick,
replaces
bitch.
understanding. All of these good things tossed to the side by God and by Jesus in place of something
Suck
to
my
them
motherfucking
more
dick.
beautiful. Faith, desperation, complete dependency. And it starts to look a lot more abusive than beautiful.
Are you losing
So,
on purpose, you
this
son
isn't
of a
me
bitch?
rejecting faith because I lack empathy. Again, I understand
Suck
why
my
people
dick,
much
bitch.
worse off than me rely as heavily as they do on faith. But the reason I'm
Let me
critiquing
put your
faith
black ass with
or
stand
even
maggot.
rejecting it in the way that I am is because I refuse to confuse comfort with truth. I understand your need, your desperation, your hope, your desire, your vulnerability, your desperation, your faith. I understand it. And for the Christians right now, they're saying, well then so what? Leave it be. Who are you to take away their toy? I'm the one standing up for all the people that had faith, that didn't get the pretty end, that don't get to stand up next Sunday and share their testimony, that were at their absolute end and reached out to the one life preserver that they were told would always be there for them and still got no result. Just because others sometimes, like a fortune cookie, happen to get results and then attribute that to the faith of the very last thing they tried doesn't make it real. Comfort, a good story, a positive testimony does not equal truth. And so I'm not going to pretend
Suck
that
my
faith is
motherfucking
beautiful.
dick, bitch.
I'm not going to pretend that it does anything, that there's anyone on the other side rewarding it, or that if there was, that would somehow be a good thing or show them to have a good nature. And it's really nothing further than that. Again, it was just an investigation into kind of a rethinking, a reframing here of something that is so pumped up and used by believers to shame, by the way, non-believers or people that are doubting or questioning because they didn't get the expected result. You don't get to do that. You don't get to prop up how it was by faith that they were saved, faith that they were made whole again, faith that the addiction left them, faith that God came and found them. You don't get to promote that all the time. And so when someone earnestly also tries the same thing, faith, but doesn't get that same result, you're left having to tell them it's actually their lack of faith and shame them and kick them further into the ground. It is not I who is low on empathy.
Bitch, you suck my motherfucking dick, bitch.
Can stone your wife or sell your daughter into slavery.
Well, we ignore those verses.
Well then, friend, it seems to me you pick and choose.
This is classic Satan.
All right, let's see it.
He'll take the word of God because he knows the word of God well, and he'll twist the word of God. Observing that the Mosaic Law has a bunch of different prescriptions of stoning and also allows a man to sell his daughter into slavery is not twisting anything. But as we're going to see in this video, this content creator twists what's in the Bible in order to authorize and justify the dogmas that he imposes upon the Bible in order to get it to say what he needs it to say.
And so then you get really confused. You're like, wait, am I following a moral God?
Every person who is ostensibly following the God of the Bible is following a God of their own making. So the question is, are you making a moral God?
Is the Bible really true? Can I really trust the Bible if it says that we're called to stone our wives and sell our daughter in slavery?
The question is not, can you trust the Bible? The question is, can you trust the interpretive tradition that you're imposing upon the Bible as a unifying framework?
This wasn't just like, hey, stone your wife. It wasn't gender-based.
This is false. There were absolutely stoning laws that were gender-based. So, for instance, in Deuteronomy 22, if a man married a woman and somehow discovered that she was not a virgin, all the men of the city were supposed to stone her. And there is absolutely no such reciprocal law prohibiting a man from engaging in premarital sex, because men were not prohibited from engaging in premarital sex, because their ideas about human sexuality and the propriety of sexual intercourse were not based on some universal notion of purity. They were based on property rights. Because when a man married a woman, he was purchasing her procreative capacities and sexual availability. Those were commodities that were bought and sold, and the woman went along with them. And when you purchased a woman's sexual availability and procreative capacities, you expected both to be in pristine, shiny new condition. And if they were not, well, that's a violation of that social contract. So that is why women were prohibited from engaging in any and all premarital sex. They were a commodity to be bought and sold.
Crock of shit.
No such expectation was imposed upon men, who were absolutely not prohibited from engaging in premarital sex in and of itself. Now, there could be inappropriate premarital sex depending on the social status of the partner, but premarital sex in and of itself is nowhere prohibited on the part of men anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. So it is entirely false to say that the Bible never prescribes stoning in a gender-based way. It absolutely does.
This was a law that if you committed adultery, yeah, you got stoned. This was Old Covenant. This was the civic law of the nation-state of Israel.
So there are two different methods of picking and choosing going on in this clip. The reference to Old Covenant and the reference to civic laws of the nation-state of Israel. The Old Covenant kind of picking and choosing has to do with the identification of these laws as part of the Mosaic Law, which Christ came to fulfill, meaning you're no longer under those laws. And there are absolutely a lot of passages in the New Testament that say that. However, there are also passages that deny that. The Gospel of Matthew, for instance, insists that the Mosaic Law will continue in effect until the heavens and the earth pass away. In fact, Jesus then goes on to say, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. And then he goes on to say, you have heard that Moses said X, well, I say Y. And Jesus ratchets up the severity of the law. The Gospel of Matthew envisions following Jesus by keeping all of the Mosaic Law. Now, if you don't like that, you're going to reinterpret that away. That's part of the picking and choosing. You are picking which part of the New Testament is going to overrule which other part of the New Testament. It is the process of negotiating with the text, because the texts are not univocal. Even the New Testament itself is not univocal. If you want to extract a single unified and consistent principle from the Bible, you have absolutely no choice but to make a decision regarding which passages are going to be centered and given priority, and then which passages are going to be subordinated to those centered passages, reinterpreted, marginalized, or just outright ignored. So when you say, oh, that's Old Covenant, you have picked and chosen. You have chosen Paul, and you have subordinated Matthew to Paul, rather than the picking and choosing that would go the other way around. Those who say, well, followers of Jesus are required to still keep the law of Moses. That would be picking Matthew and then subordinating Paul and other authors to Matthew. And you can't say, well, majority rules. That's also picking and choosing. You can't say, well, I'm going to follow what Jesus said. Nope. Jesus in Matthew is quite clear about the law continuing in effect. Jesus in other Gospels is a little less clear, but seems to suggest that the law no longer continues in effect for followers of Jesus. So you have no choice but to pick and choose. Now, that was the old covenant picking and choosing. Then we have this civic law picking and choosing. And this is something that is required to still keep the law of Moses. That would be picking Matthew and then subordinating Paul and the other authors to Matthew. And you can't say, well, majority rules. That's also picking and choosing. You can't say, well, I'm going to follow what Jesus said. Nope. Jesus in Matthew is quite clear about the law continuing in effect. Jesus in other Gospels is a little less clear, but seems to suggest that the law no longer continues in effect for followers of Jesus. So you have no choice but to pick and choose. Now, that was the old law continuing in effect. Jesus in other Gospels is a little less clear, but seems to suggest that the law no longer continues in effect for followers of Jesus. So you have no choice but to pick and choose. Now, that was the law continuing in effect. Jesus in other Gospels is a little less clear, but seems to suggest that the law no longer continues in effect for followers of Jesus. So you have no choice but to pick and choose. Now, that was the old covenant picking and choosing. Then we have this civic law picking and choosing. And this is something that is nowhere in the Bible at all. And this is the division of the Jewish law into either 2 or 3 categories so that we could pick and choose which categories are going to be left behind and which categories are going to continue in effect. Initially, it was a bipartite division into moral and ceremonial law, and we decided the moral law stays, the ceremonial law goes. And while there are some fuzzy notions of a distinction between these kinds of laws in some parts of the New Testament and in the Hebrew Bible, they are nowhere near consistent across the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and what belongs in either of those 2 categories is also nowhere prescribed in the Bible, and the people who assert that bipartite division today make different choices about what's going to go in one and what's going to go in the other. But civic law is the third designation, the tripartite division that was made centuries later, closer to Aquinas. And the idea with the civic law is that everything that goes into that pot just expired when the people of Israel were no longer an actual state. And so we don't have to worry about those at all. So these are all post-biblical ways of trying to negotiate with the text to identify the laws we want to keep versus the laws we want to shed. So that is also picking and choosing, but that picking and choosing has nothing to do with what's actually in the Bible. That picking and choosing is entirely post-biblical and arbitrary.
And then when he's talking about Exodus 21, where you can sell your daughter into slavery, that's not true.
It's absolutely true.
That wasn't slavery.
This was absolutely slavery. Here's the text of Exodus 21:7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. Now, as a slave renders the Hebrew phrase la'amah, and amah is a specific kind of enslaved girl, specifically a sex slave. This is like concubinage. This was a person who was absolutely not free and who was entirely subject to the sexual will of her master. This is a slave, pure and simple.
And it gave her rights. If she didn't want to be with the man, she could leave.
So, 2 issues here. One, the fact that the text of the Covenant Code in Exodus 21 gives rights to an enslaved person in absolutely no way, shape, or form whatsoever makes that enslavement any less enslavement. Pretty much all civilizations that practice enslavement had certain restrictions imposed upon slave masters or certain rights granted to enslaved folks. Even in the pre-Civil War American South, there were rights that were granted to enslaved folks, at least on paper. And keep in mind, when it comes to biblical slavery, all we have is what is on paper. So we can look at the Law Code of Louisiana from 1825, and it says quite explicitly there that a master is not allowed to beat his enslaved person to death or even maim him. That is a right granted to an enslaved person at the very peak of pre-Civil War American Southern slavery. So the notion that to grant an enslaved person rights somehow magically makes enslavement no longer enslavement is laughably false. And even more laughably false is the notion that the Covenant Code in Exodus 21 allows a girl sold into sex slavery to just leave if she doesn't like her master. That's absolutely false. Here is the entirety of the Covenant Code's treatment of the question of sex slavery. Starting in verse 7, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. And this is a reference to the fact that a debt slave, an Israelite who has been sold into debt slavery or sold himself into debt slavery, goes free in the 7th year. When it comes to female slaves, that is not the case, at least not in the Covenant Code. In Deuteronomy 15, it is the case that both male and female Israelite debt slaves go free in the 7th year. Another indication of the multivocality of the biblical text, and in this case, the legislation of the Hebrew Bible. But we go on. If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself as a concubine, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. Couple things to note here. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, which means he can sell her to other Israelites. What he's not allowed to do is sell her out of the country. And the redeemed part doesn't mean he just gives her her clothes and says you're free to go. The redeemed part means he can sell her to someone else, either back to the person who originally sold her or someone else. It's not giving her back to the person who originally sold her. Redeem means to buy back. There has to be another exchange of money. So here, it's if the man doesn't like her, he can sell her again as long as it is not to foreign people. But let's continue. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. So all this is saying is, if he buys a sex slave that's to be given to his son as a concubine or a wife, then he must treat her as if she is a legitimate wife, a first wife. Verse 10, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. If he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out without debt, without payment of money. So there is one condition in which she is allowed to just walk free. And that is the condition that she has been purchased as a concubine or a wife, and then the man marries a second wife, and then diminishes her food, clothing, or marital rights. In that case, she has a claim to make against her master, and she can walk out free without anybody having to pay for her. So there is a condition under which she walks free. That condition is not that she just does not like the guy who purchased her. That is laughably incorrect.
All this is going back to the garden where Satan looked at the man and woman and said, you can't trust God.
First, Satan has absolutely nothing to do with the Garden of Eden, because Satan was not the name of an individuated, malevolent figure until after the Hebrew Bible was complete. At best, Satan is an office within the divine council that could be occupied by anybody in certain parts of the Hebrew Bible. And guess what? Satan is never anywhere in the Hebrew Bible identified in the Garden of Eden. But also, guess what? The serpent in the Garden of Eden was right, as even the text of Genesis 3 makes explicit. Because the serpent tells Eve, you will not die, but you will become like one of the gods. That's Genesis 3, verse 5. Now, Adam and Eve do not die according to the threat of Genesis 2:17. Whether you want to characterize that as a lie or God changing their mind or whatever, what God threatens in Genesis 2:17 simply does not happen. The serpent was right. You shall not die. And then in verse 22, God acknowledges that the other thing the serpent said would happen happened. They have become like one of us, like one of the gods. The two things the serpent said would happen, happened. The thing God said would happen, didn't happen. If the text of Genesis 2 and 3 has absolutely anything to say about what happened in the Garden of Eden, the serpent was right.
Did God really say you shouldn't eat the apple?
That wasn't the serpent's question. Now who's twisting things?
So it is important for you to understand the Word of God deeply.
You don't understand what even the Word of God means in the Bible, because it never refers to the Bible. It never refers to the Scriptures as Scriptures. It refers to God's message and to Jesus. And that message is the message, not the medium. When you understand the phrase Word of God to refer to the text of the Bible, you misunderstand it to be referring to the medium rather than the message. So one, you have misidentified what the Word of God is. Two, you don't know the first thing about the Word of God if we accept that it refers to the Bible. You are woefully, inadequately informed about the biblical text. What you are informed about is an interpretive tradition and a negotiating tactic. You're familiar with how we have imposed unifying frameworks on the text in order to get the text to say what we want them to say. And so you refer to the end result, the outcome of that process of negotiation with which you are acquainted, as if it were the Bible itself. And it's not. You are confusing the Bible for your interpretive tradition regarding the Bible. You need to get remedially educated about the Bible itself, rather than just the interpretive tradition that allows you to make the Bible say what you need it to say.
I send a free daily devotional every single morning. Click the link in my...
Now I'm good. And the fit for this video, I think, says Romans go home. Tradition that allows you to make the Bible say what you need it to say.
I send a free daily devotional every single morning. Click the link in my...
Now I'm good. And the fit for this video.
Pay attention to this booking image. 3 angles, front, left profile, right profile, of a suspect who looks like he should be in a high school classroom. Look at his face. Look at how young he appears. The booking officer who processed him that night actually paused the procedure twice to ask whether a guardian had been notified. Now look closer. Look past the face. Look at the arms. The tattoos covering both shoulders and running down to his wrists aren't the impulsive ink of a teenager. They're years of deliberate layered artwork that takes time and money and a certain settled sense of permanence to accumulate. Look at the number on that booking board. 00145897. That number represents 11 prior arrests across 3 states.
God damn it.
Here's the question that haunted every detective who
Jesus
ever looked at
fucking
this image.
goddamn Christ.
How does a man with 11 prior arrests
Jesus fucking Christ.
walk free? The answer to that question
Jesus
is the
fucking
most
goddamn
unsettling
Christ.
part of this entire story. Because
Jesus
the answer
fucking
is standing
Christ.
right there in that image, holding that booking board, looking exactly like someone nobody would ever
Jesus
believe was the
fucking
most
Christ.
dangerous person in the room. You know that feeling when you assume you know exactly what you're looking at? When your brain processes an image so fast, so automatically, that you never stop to question whether what you're seeing is actually what's there. We all do it. It's how human perception works. We build shortcuts, categories. We see a face that looks young, and we assign it youth. We see a small frame, and we assign it harmlessness. Devlin Ross spent 9 years Categories. We see a face that looks young, and we assign it youth. We see a small frame, and we assign it harmlessness. Devlin Ross spent 9 years turning that cognitive shortcut into a criminal empire. Let me tell you about Kellerton, a mid-sized city in the inland southeast that most people outside the region have never heard of. Population just under 200,000. A city with decent neighborhoods and struggling ones, with a strong church community and a stubborn poverty problem and the particular mix of ambition and frustration that characterizes cities of its size and history. Kellerton had a drug problem. Not unique to Kellerton, most cities its size did. But Kellerton's drug problem had, over the course of nearly a decade, become unusually organized, unusually efficient, unusually difficult for law enforcement to penetrate or disrupt. Supply arrived reliably. Distribution was structured. Disputes were resolved quickly and quietly. The whole operation ran with the discipline that Detective Yvonne Quarles of the Kellerton PD's Organized Crime Unit described in a 2019 interview as almost corporate. At the top of that corporation, giving orders that moved through layers of intermediaries before reaching anyone who actually touched product or money, was a 31-year-old man who looked 17. And before we get to Devlin, we need to talk about Wendell Price. Because Wendell is where this story truly starts. Wendell is the reason any of this came to light at all. Wendell Price was 47 years old. He was a certified public accountant who had been practicing in Kellerton for 19 years. He had a small but well-regarded firm on the 4th floor of a downtown office building, a wife named Loretta who taught elementary school, and 2 daughters in college. People who knew him described him as quiet, careful, detail-oriented. A man who was genuinely good at his job and who built a comfortable, respectable life through confidence and discipline. He was also, for 7 years, Devlin Ross's money laundering operation, and Wendell Price made one catastrophic mistake that got him killed. To understand what happened to Wendell Price, you have to understand how Devlin Ross built the Venom Street Collective from nothing.
God damn it.
Devlin was born in Kellerton in 1987, the youngest of 3 children raised by a single mother in the city's Eastwick neighborhood, an area that had seen better decades. His mother, a woman named Gloria, worked 2 jobs and kept the household together through sheer force of will. By every account, she was a good mother in impossible circumstances, working constantly, fighting for her kids, trying to keep them pointed towards something better than what the neighborhood offered. Gloria had one particular worry that she expressed to teachers, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen, that Devlin's size would make him a target. He'd been small his whole life, significantly smaller than other kids his age, the result of a growth hormone condition diagnosed when he was 8 that his mother couldn't afford to treat consistently. By the time he was in his early teens, he'd stopped growing at around 5 feet 1 inch. The kids at school were merciless, the way kids can be when they find a difference to exploit. Devlin got into fights constantly in his first 2 years of middle school, not because he was aggressive by nature, but because other kids kept testing him, kept assuming that small meant weak, kept learning the same lesson the hard way that adults would spend the next 2 decades failing to learn. What Gloria hadn't anticipated, what nobody had anticipated, was that Devlin's response to being small wouldn't be vulnerability. It would be strategy. He understood from an early age that his appearance created a consistent set of assumptions in other people's minds. Adults underestimated him. Authority figures didn't take him seriously. People who should have been watching him weren't because he didn't look like what they were watching for. He started using that at 13. Small things at first, running errands for older crew members in Eastwick who thought he was useful because nobody paid attention to a kid who looked 11, passing messages, carrying packages through checkpoints that would have caught anyone older, building a reputation, quietly, carefully, as someone reliable and invisible in a world where those 2 qualities together were worth more than almost anything else. By the time he was 17, Devlin was running his own small operation. By 22, he founded the Venom Street Collective. The name was deliberate, Venom, something small that could kill you before you realized you'd been bitten. He told the founding members of the collective, 6 men he'd known since childhood, all of them from Eastwick, all of them with the particular loyalty that comes from shared history and shared struggle, that the organization would operate on 3 principles: patience, invisibility, and discipline. Anyone who violated any of those 3 principles was out. No exceptions, no second chances. That sounds simple. Criminal organizations always sound simple when you describe their principles. What made Devlin's different was the consistency with which he enforced them. Over 9 years, 6 founding members became 3 because 2 had been caught acting without authorization, and 1 had developed a substance abuse problem that compromised his judgment.
Jesus,
All 3
goddamn
removals
fucking
happened cleanly.
Christ.
No violence, no drama. The removed
fucking
members
Christ.
simply found themselves gradually cut off from the network, their access reduced and then eliminated,
Goddamn
until one
fucking
day they
cunt
realized
Christ.
they weren't in the organization anymore. Devlin didn't need to be violent to maintain
Fucking
discipline.
Christ.
He needed people to understand that the organization functioned on his terms, and that there was no version of the organization that functioned on any other terms. That understanding was the discipline.
Jesus, goddamn
The organizational
cunt
structure he
fucking
built was
Christ.
unlike anything Kellerton law enforcement had encountered before. There was no single visible leader who could be arrested and leave the operation headless. There were no meetings where everyone gathered in one place. There were layers. Distribution managers who didn't know the names of their suppliers, suppliers who communicated only through intermediaries, money moving through legitimate businesses with no visible connection to street-level operations. And at the very center of the financial architecture, handling the accounts, structuring the transactions, making the money disappear into legitimacy, was Wendell Price. Nobody has ever fully established how Devlin recruited Wendell. The most credible theory, based on financial records examined during the investigation, is that Devlin had identified Wendell's firm as handling accounts for several Eastwick business owners connected to Venom Street collective activities, and had used that existing relationship as leverage. Not a threat exactly, more a recognition. Wendell already knew where some of the money came from. Devlin simply made the arrangement explicit and substantially more profitable. For 7 years, the arrangement worked perfectly. Wendell was good at his job. The money flowed cleanly. The collective's finances stayed invisible. Devlin expanded into 3 additional states: Nashville, Birmingham, and Memphis, using the same structural model he built in Kellerton. And then Wendell got greedy. It started small, the way these things always do. A slight mischaracterization here, an undeclared deposit there, amounts small enough that a casual review wouldn't catch them. Wendell had been living with the stress of what he was doing for 7 years, and somewhere along the line he'd apparently decided that the stress deserved better compensation than he was receiving. He'd been doing the work of someone who knew their employer would kill them if they made a mistake, and getting paid like someone who processed standard corporate accounts. That calculation had been festering for years, and somewhere in 2019, based on the financial record timeline reconstructed by investigators, Wendell had started skimming. By early 2020, the amounts weren't small anymore. In March of 2020, Wendell made a transfer of $900,000 into an account that had no connection
Kiss that
to any
fucking
structure
horn goodbye, you
Devlin
son of a
recognized. A private account, apparently Wendell's exit fund. His plan to disappear. Loretta later told investigators that Wendell had been researching property in Portugal and Costa Rica in the months before his death. She thought it was a retirement fantasy. It was an escape route. Devlin's financial oversight was meticulous. He didn't catch the skimming immediately. Wendell had hidden it well, spreading the small thefts across dozens of accounts over months. But he caught the $900,000 transfer within 3 weeks. And when he did, the decision he made was immediate and completely unemotional. On August 14, 2020, Wendell Price was found in the parking garage beneath his downtown office building. 22 stab wounds. His laptop beside him, untouched. His briefcase, containing client documents worth far more than any robbery would have yielded, also untouched. His wallet with $400 in cash still in his inside jacket pocket. The message was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. This wasn't robbery. This was consequence. Loretta Price received the call at 7:43 in the morning. She'd been expecting Wendell home from a late client meeting the night before, and had assumed he'd decided to stay in the city rather than drive home after dark. She later told investigators that she'd been irritated when he hadn't called, that her last feeling toward her husband before she found out he was gone had been mild annoyance. She has said in interviews since that she still struggles with that, the weight of the last emotion you felt towards someone before you lost them. There's no way to resolve that. There's no place to put it that makes it feel less heavy. The Kellerton Police Department's Homicide Division took the case. The lead detective was a 17-year veteran named Floyd Obenhouse, a methodical, thorough investigator who'd cleared 43 of his last 50 homicide cases and who approached the Price murder the same way he approached everything, systematically, starting with the victim's life and working outward. What Floyd found when he started looking at Wendell Price's financial life stopped him cold. The shell companies, the layered accounts, the real estate transactions that didn't correspond to any property Wendell or his firm legitimately managed.
Now
A
fuck up and
financial
leave that
structure of
goddamn
considerable
phone number.
sophistication built around the fundamental goal of making large amounts of money look like it came from somewhere it didn't. Floyd knew immediately he was looking at a money laundering operation. What he didn't immediately know was whose. He called in the Organized Crime Unit. Detective Yvonne Quarles was assigned to support the investigation on October 2nd, 2020, 7 weeks after Wendell's murder. Quarles had been working organized crime in Kellerton for 6 years and knew the landscape of the city's criminal infrastructure better than almost anyone in the department. She looked at the financial structure Floyd had uncovered and recognized the architecture. Not the specific companies, those were new to her, but the design principles, the layering, the legitimate business fronts, the geographic spread, the discipline. This is Venom Street Collective money, she told Floyd at their first joint meeting. I've been trying to get inside this organization for 3 years. This is the first time I've seen the financial layer. Floyd asked her who ran the collective. Quarles told him what she knew, a street name, Shorty King, and a physical description that matched nothing in any of the department's existing organized crime files, because nobody had ever successfully put a legal name to the alias. 3 years of working the collective, and she'd never gotten close to identifying the person at the top. Informants clammed up the moment she pushed toward leadership. Witnesses evaporated. The organization protected its leadership with an absolute consistency that Quarles had never seen matched. They didn't know yet that Devlin Ross had been sitting in their police department twice asking them questions. Let's go back to that, because it's important. It's actually central to understanding how Devlin operated and how long he'd been doing it successfully. The first visit had been in February of 2019,
God damn it.
over a year before Wendell's murder. Devlin had walked into the Kellerton PD's Community Relations Office, a public-facing function designed to maintain engagement with neighborhood residents, and presented himself as a concerned young person from the Eastwick area, worried about gang violence near his family's home. The officer who met with him that day was a community liaison named Dennis Fowler. Fowler had no reason to be suspicious of a young-looking man expressing concern about gang violence in his neighborhood. That was exactly the kind of engagement the Community Relations Office existed to facilitate. Fowler spent 40 minutes with Devlin, describing the department's current enforcement priorities in Eastwick, which organizations they were actively targeting, what operations were in progress. Devlin asked thoughtful questions, expressed appropriate concern about younger kids in the neighborhood getting drawn into gang activity, asked what signs a community member should watch for, thanked Fowler sincerely, and left. He'd walked out with more operational intelligence about the investigation into Venom Street collective activities than any of his network's informants had been able to provide in months. He'd identified 2 active surveillance operations, the names of 3 detectives assigned to organized crime work in Eastwick, and the general timeline of an enforcement sweep being planned for spring. The sweep was adjusted before it happened. 2 members of the collective who would have been caught in it were quietly moved to different areas of operation. When the sweep occurred, it netted minor players and achieved nothing of significance. The second visit was in November of 2019, 9 months later. This time he went to a different office, the Crime Prevention Unit, which held public meetings about drug activity in specific neighborhoods. Devlin attended one such meeting as a member of the public, sitting in the back row, listening carefully as officers described enforcement challenges and community resources. Afterward, he approached the presenting officer, a sergeant named Bridget Tanaka, with questions about the specific areas of Eastwick where enforcement was being concentrated. Sergeant Tanaka later told investigators that she remembered the young man clearly. He seemed really engaged, she said, really concerned about his community. I thought it was great to see a young person taking that kind of interest. She paused for a moment before continuing. I told him everything he asked about. I thought I was doing my job, connecting with the community, building trust. She looked away from the investigator during that part of her account. I thought I was building trust, she said again. He was taking inventory. After Quarles identified the Venom Street collective connection to Wendell's murder, she and Floyd spent 3 months trying to connect a real identity to the Shorty King alias. Every source they cultivated dried up. Every witness they approached suddenly couldn't remember anything useful. Every informant they reached out to either had nothing or developed selective amnesia about anything related to collective leadership. The wall wasn't unusual. The collective had maintained it for 9 years. But the consistency of it, the absolute, impenetrable silence around Devlin's identity, told investigators something important. This wasn't the ordinary code of silence that characterized street-level gang culture. This was something more deliberate, more cultivated. An organization whose members had been trained from the beginning to protect one specific piece of information above everything else. Who was Shorty King? What they needed was someone on the inside who had a reason to talk. And finding that person, it turned out, was going to take another year. Through early 2021, Floyd and Quarles continued building their case against whoever had ordered Wendell Price's murder. They'd assembled substantial financial evidence connecting the shell companies in Wendell's books to the Venom Street Collective's operational accounts. They documented the legal system. They mapped the geographic spread of the organization across 4 states. They had a clear picture of the what. They still didn't have the who. More precisely, they had a who, Shorty King, but no legal identity attached to it. Quarles tried a different approach in the spring of 2021. Instead of working from the top down, trying to identify...
favorite, but I do have maybe a couple reasons why we can get into why prophecies are really important before we touch on the prophecies themselves. I put some slides together. Let me know if the slides are unreadable. I can zoom in if I really need to, but hopefully I won't need to.
God damn it.
Okay, so I've got a number of slides, and I'm hoping that they're going to show up in the right order. And of course they don't, which is fine. I'll
You
get them in the
stupid
order we get them. But
motherfucker.
a couple notes on why the prophecies are so darn important. Primarily because not only does the Bible tell us that the prophecies are so darn important, but also because church history does. In fact, I've got some quotes for you, and I can read them for you, or I can hopefully find the slide. Since OBS didn't import them in the right order. I can find you the slide with the quotes, or I'm assuming they put them at the end. Let's see. I apologize that when I imported my slideshow, I just assume that they imported them in the right direction, but they stuck them at the end, which is fine. So,
God damn it.
The prophecy starts as early as the Torah. God says in Deuteronomy 18, any prophet who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet dies. So prophecy is not just important, it's critical, because if you're speaking things that are untrue, you get the axe. It says, "Now you may ask yourself, how can we recognize a word that the Lord has not spoken? If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, but the thing does not take place or prove true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously, and don't be frightened by it. It's going to be okay." And then we've got another quote from our friend Jeremiah. It says, "When the word of that prophet comes true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet," right? So the Old Testament lays the groundwork easily for us to know why prophecy is important. Because if the prophecy fails, like, you know it's not from God. And the other interesting thing is the Hebrew Bible tells you that it's clearly going to be a prophecy. You don't have to guess. Amos 3:7 says, "Surely the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets." So we're told from the outset, right, that not only are the prophecies important, but also you're going to know what they are. You're going to be able to test them. In fact, it's kind of your job to test them, right? That's one of the things that you need to do. Because if somebody's speaking in my name presumptuously, you got to take care of that person. The New Testament carries on this tradition, although, as we'll see, their method of interpretation isn't very good. But in the New Testament, we've got, just in the Gospels, no less than 28 different prophecies concerning Jesus from the Old Testament, most of them coming from Matthew, and then John next, and Luke. And Mark isn't as concerned with references to the Old Testament as being fulfilled prophecies, but you'll find specifically in the book of Hebrews, you'll find a bunch of references to the Old Testament that were supposed fulfillments. And all of these citations are supposed to be there to tell you that Jesus is the thing that we want him to be. That's the goal.
Stupid!
Jesus himself said that the prophecies it says in Matthew, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, for he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then
He had two
would the
whores on me.
scriptures be
I still
fulfilled,
stuck my dick in my
which
butt.
say it must happen in this way?" So Jesus is saying, listen, I can do anything I want to, but I'm doing this particular thing because it was already written of me, and I have to do it. And he doubles down earlier in that same chapter in verse 24. It says, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him." So he must do what is written, right? The prophecies of the Old Testament cannot fail. They have to come true. And then Luke 24:44 says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." So Jesus himself is telling you right out of the gate that the goal, everything he's doing, is to fulfill the prophecies. Like, this is goal number one. Early church, they thought the prophecies were super important. My favorite author from the early church that doubles and triples and quadruples down on prophecies is Justin Martyr. In his first and second apology, he said, first apology alone, he spends 16 chapters dedicated to the prophecies. So one of the earliest church fathers right out of the gate trying to justify, specifically writing to Trypho the Jew, why Jesus is the Messiah, he spends 16 chapters using prophecies to make that justification. And then I've got a quote from Justin Martyr down here. It says, "And I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations affected by those 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and by which this very man who was crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God and man, and being crucified and dying." Now, this is an interesting quote because not only is Justin Martyr in this particular section of the dialogue trying to claim that there were prophecies about Jesus that were fulfilled, but he goes as far to say also the Jewish people have been actively removing prophecies about Jesus. That's why it says the 70 elders. This is a loose reference to the Greek version of the Old Testament. This is the Septuagint, which the Jews kind of unanimously didn't accept, but the Christian movement did. And Justin Martyr is upset thinking that the Jews only rejected the LXX because of these prophecies about Jesus. So Justin Martyr thinks everything is resting on these prophecies. Same thing with Origen. Origen goes through great lengths in his disputation with Celsus to try to say that, listen, I know that there were other individuals in Greco-Roman culture that were dying and rising individuals, but Jesus is special because the Old Testament prophesied that it would happen. It says, "For because the Savior was sent afterwards, the Holy Spirit was sent also, that the prediction of the prophet might be fulfilled, as it was necessary that the fulfillment of the prophecy should be known to posterity." So Origen makes all kinds of arguments for why Jesus' experience, while it might be similar to other deities or demigods that you've heard of, ours is unique because Jesus fulfilled a whole string of other prophecies that nobody else could have fulfilled. And so right from the onset, we're kind of told from church history and the Bible that the prophecies are kind of the key. That's like the linchpin of the religion, because if the prophecies aren't true, then the religion's just simply not true. And you might be thinking, well, what about the resurrection, right? And this is a pretty typical Christian rebuttal, which is, well, as long as the resurrection is true, everything else fixes itself. But that's not really the case. And for the same reason we spoke about before, the problem with resurrection, according to Origen and according to others, is that there were multiple resurrections. First of all, it's unfalsifiable, right? If you claim somebody resurrected, there's no way to prove that an individual resurrected in all of human history, as your data points would suggest that that didn't happen. But even if that is the case, we've got lots of other ancient resurrections. Most notable are Aristeus, Alcestis, Nero, and even Ramses II. There's a story that Ramses II went down to Hades and came back up. And Origen knew this. Origen, one of the early church fathers that was dialoguing on these issues, states that this was true. People already know about these other dying and rising individuals. So again, we're left to this argument, well, just dying and rising isn't good enough, not only because it's not testable, but because there are others. We need something else to fill in that gap. I think the prophecies become the perfect thing. Now with that, I want to talk about the actual prophecies. There are some famous prophecies that most of you have probably heard of, probably maybe even read for yourself. Maybe you've heard them at like Christmas plays, different things like that. So we're going to kind of start at the beginning and walk through some of these prophecies.
He feels like a jackass.
And we're going to look at these prophecies kind of like you would if you were doing an exegetical paper. I had a New Testament professor once that comically said, when he assigned us an exegetical paper, if your exegesis is the same level as the New Testament authors, you're going to get an F. And I think that's kind of what these prophecies demonstrate, is that the New Testament authors couldn't properly exegete the Old Testament text, which is why you get all kinds of nonsensical interpretations and takes. The other problem, which we'll see clearly with this particular prophecy, is that the New Testament authors couldn't read Hebrew. It's possible that they could speak some Aramaic, but they certainly couldn't read Hebrew. They almost exclusively quote from the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is why so often if you read the prophecy in the New Testament and then flip to the Old Testament to see where it's at, it won't read the same as the way it's quoted in the New Testament. It's going to read differently because they're reading from a Greek edition, which is actually not all that great sometimes. We'll see this with Isaiah. And we're reading from an English translation of the actual Hebrew text. So
the actual
let's
text.
Get right into the virgin birth. Matthew 1:22 through 23 talks about the virgin birth thusly, that it must have taken place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So you would rightly think, oh, well, there must be a spot in Isaiah that says this is the virgin that's going to give birth to the Savior, and certainly that would be a fair expectation. Most translations of Isaiah is going to read a little bit different. Isaiah 7:14 actually says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." This is a striking difference, and the striking difference should be obvious to most people, which is namely it says it's a young woman, not a virgin, and that she's already with child. The Hebrew phrase ha'el machara just means a pregnant young woman. The problem is that when they translated this text into Greek, they translated it at a time period where the Greek word parthenos could be used to refer to a young woman who's either pregnant or not pregnant, or with child or not with child, right? It was kind of a generic use of the word. We even see the same word used in the writings of Homer to refer to a woman who's married and has already had a child. We see the same thing in Genesis 34 in the Greek Septuagint. It's used to refer to Dinah after she's already been sexually assaulted by Shechem. So we know there's a point in history where Parthenos certainly could have been used to refer to just a young woman. By the time we get to the New Testament period, like a lot of words do, they start to morph in how they get used within society. By the time we get to the time period of Jesus and when the Gospels were being written, Parthenos was used almost exclusively to refer to a woman who's a virgin, whether she's married or not isn't all relative. What's important is that she hasn't had a child yet, right? So Matthew is looking at this Greek text and thinking, oh, this must be referring to a literal miraculous virgin birth, which not only is it not referring to that, if all he did was just read the context of Isaiah 7, he would know that not only does the context have nothing to do with a virgin birth, it's certainly not about a Messiah. If you just open up Isaiah chapter 7, you'll find that the prophecy is actually about the days of King Ahaz. In the days of King Ahaz, it says he's being attacked by the son of Uzziah, the king. He is the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, but he's being attacked by Rezin, the king of Aram, who's leading northern Israel. At this time period, the northern Israelites were already at odds with Judea, and they made an alliance with the Arameans, that was their neighbors just on the other side of Damascus, before they absorbed Damascus into their territory. But it starts out in verse 2, it says, when the house of David heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So the setting is super clear. There is a war afoot, and the king of Judah is afraid that his kingdom is toppled, and Judah is still God's kind of favorite kingdom at this point. And so God sends the prophet twice in this chapter to kind of shore up the faith of King Ahaz. And the second of those prophecies reads as thus. Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign of the Lord your God, that it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? So God's just telling them outright, hey, ask for a sign. I'll give you a sign. I want to shore up your faith. Ahaz has like this fake piety, saying, no, I won't ask God for a sign. So God's like, forget it, I'll give you a sign. Verse 14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. And so God is simply saying there's a child that's about to be born, King Ahaz. Before that child is born, those two kingdoms that are giving you trouble, they're going to be wiped out. How are they going to be wiped out? He tells you in the next verse, verse 17, the Lord will bring on you and on your people and your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So the prophecy is about the king of Assyria coming down, wiping out Aram, wiping out Israel, waging war with Judea, but not succeeding. And that happens. If you just turn the page to chapter 8, you'll find in chapter 8 that the king of Assyria swoops down and fulfills the prophecy in chapter 7. And as it's happening, the prophet himself, Isaiah, calls out twice, O Emmanuel, God is with us. So the prophecy not only was for 725 years before Jesus, it was fulfilled 720 years before Jesus. So this certainly couldn't be about Jesus. But when you have a person that you believe must be the Messiah by all costs, no matter what you do is you scour the internet, or we would scour the internet. They scour the Hebrew Bible and say, what can I find here? What can I find here that sounds like my Messiah? And just call it a prophecy about my Messiah. And that's how you get Isaiah 7 being a prophecy about a virgin birth when it had nothing to do with the virgin birth in the first place. Certainly not about a Messiah. There's no Messiah mentioned here. The next, probably most popular prophecy is born in Bethlehem. And of course, this seems like a winner, right? Because he was born in Bethlehem, wasn't he? This was predicted theoretically in Micah 5:2. When the children are commanded to be executed 2 years and under, this prophecy is quoted as being the reason. It says they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler, who is to shepherd my people. The first thing you'll notice again is the translation differs a little bit, because they're quoting it from the Greek. I've got a quotation here from the Hebrew, and that's fine. The quotation's close enough for what we're doing. Micah 5:2, however, says, but you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. And this is really important, because there's one word in here that Christians keep ignoring over and over again. It says he's going to rule. He's going to rule in Israel. That's a real active verb. That's something that somebody must be doing for it to be fulfilled. So the prophecy itself is really interesting, because we're like, well, shoot, he was born in Bethlehem, so he must have fulfilled it. Well, hundreds of thousands of people have probably been born in Bethlehem over the years.
Now,
that doesn't make them the Messiah. What makes you the Messiah is that you rule over your people Israel in Israel. But it does get a little bit deeper than that. Before I get into the really deep part, it's important to recognize that the text doesn't explicitly state that this individual is born in Bethlehem. I understand that it could feel that way when you're reading it, but it doesn't actually say that. I'm going to read it very carefully and point out something that I think gets overlooked. It says, but you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth. Okay, so right off the rip, we're not talking about a village. We're not talking about a town or a city. We're talking about a clan. This is really interesting. Both Bethlehem and Ephrath were the oldest ancestors of King David that we find in the Hebrew Bible. These are, in fact, Bethlehem and Ephrathah are named after these two ancestors, right? So actually what Micah is referring to is not that a city is going to be the birthplace of this individual. He's actually pointing to the lineage. What he's actually saying is that the person who rules over Israel is going to be born from this royal dynastic lineage that goes all the way back to these famous ancestors that you guys all know. So the location of his birth isn't really even that important to Micah 5:2, but what is important in Micah 5:2, if you read it in context, is that the individual is going to be a ruler. In fact, if you go down to verse 4, it says he will stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure, for he shall be the great one. To the ends of the earth he shall be the one of peace. So what's really interesting is, if you just go back one chapter in Micah, Micah describes, Micah chapter 4, this time of great peace, where the wolf lies down with the lamb, so on and so forth, that type of a peace that we see in Isaiah as well. And when we get to chapter 5, and it talks about this Messiah being the one of peace, that's what it's talking about. Whoever this Messiah is, he's going to rule in Israel, and he's going to be the one that brings peace and security for his people. It says they'll live in security. And as you know, that certainly didn't happen when Jesus was around. They got decimated by the Romans. Another famous prophecy is obviously, well, he came from the line of David. We got that in the bag at least, right? We've got the birth narrative in Matthew and Luke. Both of them traced his lineage all the way back to David. So we at least got one prophecy in the bag. But unfortunately, there's some problems with that as well. There are some contradictions in the lineage that don't match up to the Old Testament. We're not going to cover that right now. It's not important, but just know that even the lineages given in both Luke and Matthew aren't, they're not sound. But listen to what we've got in Matthew. Matthew says, when we get close to the deportation period in Babylon, it says that Josiah was the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon, and after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel. Well, this is really interesting. So Matthew includes the lineage of Jesus going through a guy named Jeconiah. He's got a secondary name. His nickname was Coniah in the Hebrew Bible. And if you've read Jeremiah, you'll find an interesting problem with Coniah. It says in Jeremiah 22:30, "Thus saith the Lord, record this man as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judea." So what's really interesting is nobody after Jeconiah is allowed to be king in Judah. It's not going to happen. His lineage was cursed when he went into Babylon, which means Matthew's lineage is now useless. The fact that Matthew traced it through Jeconiah is hugely problematic. So you might be able to say, okay, well, I don't know. What about Luke? Luke's got a genealogy that does not go through Jeconiah, and you'll see why in a second. In Luke, it lists of the son of Melech, son of Menna, son of Mattatha, son of Nathan, and then son of David. Well, this is interesting. It goes through Nathan rather than Solomon in Luke's genealogy, and this turned out to be a huge problem. Because Solomon, there are two things we know about Solomon in regards to the Messiah. 1 Chronicles 22 says, "His name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be a son to me, and I will be a father to him, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever." So right off the rip, the Messiah, the one whose royal throne is going to be established forever, goes through Solomon. Which means you can't have a lineage of the Messiah that goes through Nathan. And in fact, the New Testament tries to play it off by saying that Jesus was adopted into the lineage, because the lineage goes to Joseph. Neither one of these lineages ended Mary. Mary was one of the daughters of Aaron, it says in Luke. Luke chapter 1. He wasn't related to David at all. But 2 Samuel 7:12 says something really interesting. "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom." Meaning, the Messiah can't just be adopted willy-nilly into the Davidic line. The Messiah comes from the loins of King David. So the lineage of Jesus is just fraught with failures. Not to mention that it's not even a complete lineage, because there are errors in the lineage. For example, since we've got it on the screen, Jeconiah, his father is listed as Josiah. Jeconiah's father was not Josiah, that was his grandfather. Just a complete fail on Matthew's part. If you go back to the lineage of Jeconiah, it's pretty clear that Josiah is his grandfather. Another favorite prophecy, and this seems so obvious because they talk about it so much, is in fact, well, he was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. That's such a specific prophecy, being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. You can't really fake that kind of a thing. You know what I mean? That'd be a difficult thing to coordinate or to put into the self-fulfilling category. But there's problems here too. Matthew 27:9-10 says, "Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price. And they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me." So the first thing you'll notice is, Matthew is quoting this prophecy in accordance with Jesus being betrayed for 30 pieces, but even in Matthew's reading, it's not entirely clear that the prophecy is talking about Jesus or a Messiah being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. He's literally just picking up on the 30 pieces of silver and saying, "Oh man, here's 30 pieces of silver. I got 30 pieces of silver in this story. Let's just connect them into a prophecy." But it gets worse, because you're going to notice above my head, it doesn't say Jeremiah 11:12, it says Zechariah 11:12, because what Matthew quoted doesn't exist in Jeremiah. To be sure, the last part of that sentence, when he purchases the potter's field, that there is a slight allusion to Jeremiah there. There's a spot in Jeremiah where Jeremiah purchases the potter's field, but it has nothing to do with the 30 pieces of silver and absolutely nothing to do with the Messiah. Matthew actually mixed up two different passages that have some vague similarities to them. Zechariah 11:12 is where we find the 30 pieces of silver. It says in Zechariah 11:12, "Then I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them." So they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, "Throw it into the treasury. This Lord's price at which I was valued by them." So again, you'll notice the quotation's not one-to-one, because again, Matthew's quoting from Greek, I'm quoting from the Hebrew to English. But you can see that the 30 pieces of silver that gets thrown back from Zechariah 11:12, and all of your study Bibles that have references will tell you this. So Matthew is kind of a goof. He misattributes the Old Testament so much it's hard to take him seriously, and I think this one is rather egregious. But you might ask yourself, what's actually happening in Zechariah 11? Well, I think it's kind of important, because there's no Messiah being portrayed in Matthew chapter 11. In fact, the shepherd himself is the one who gives back the 30 pieces of silver. There's a performative prophecy that's happening in Zechariah 11 where God is having Zechariah the prophet act out a scene. And that scene is supposed to be representative of God's dealing with Israel and with Judah. So the prophecy reads like this. When he takes on the implements of a shepherd to shepherd over the flock of Israel, even though God already said they're doomed to destruction, Zechariah says, I will not be your shepherd. So he takes on the role of the shepherd and he gives up right away. He says, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those that are left devour the flesh of one another. I took my staff favor and I broke it, annulling the covenant that I had made with all people. So it was annulled on that day, and the sheep merchants who were watching me knew that it was from the word of the Lord. And I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it into the treasury, this lordly price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them into the treasury in the house of the Lord, and I broke my second staff unity, annulling the family ties between Judah and Israel. So the prophecy is not actually about a Messiah being betrayed. It's actually about a failed shepherd over a failed people group who doesn't get their wages. That's it. Nobody's being betrayed. There's no second individual here throwing the money back. If this is supposed to be an image of Jesus being the shepherd being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, it fails, because it simply does give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it into the treasury, this lordly price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them into the treasury in the house of the Lord, and I broke my second staff unity, annulling the family ties between Judah and Israel. So the prophecy is not actually about a Messiah being betrayed. It's actually about a failed shepherd over a failed people group who doesn't get their wages. That's it. Nobody's being betrayed. There's no second individual here throwing the money back. If this is supposed to be an image of Jesus being the shepherd being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, it fails, because it simply doesn't match the context of the prophecy. There's another shepherd in the chapter who's even worse than the first shepherd. Neither one of them could be compared to Jesus if he is the good shepherd. Nothing in this chapter could be applied to Jesus. It's clear that Matthew just remembered the words 30 shekels of silver in the Hebrew Bible and tried to find a way to, out of context, apply it to Jesus. And it didn't really work all that well. All you got to do is go back to read it and find out that it's a failure. Another favorite is the triumphal entry. Obviously, yes, he rode. Everyone knows Jesus rode the donkey. I don't know if we can deny that. Matthew 21:4-5 says, this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And to be sure, this is not a one-to-one, but pretty good match of what actually Zechariah reads. So rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So, interestingly enough, like Christians are going to read this and say, ding, 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 we finally got a winner. But unfortunately, the context of the passage and the phrasing within the passage already is a huge problem. Before we go to the context, again, it says that he's an actual king and that he's victorious. You might be asking yourself, what does it mean to be a victorious king? Well, the first thing is you actually have to be a king on the throne over the people. The Messiah means to be anointed, in this case anointed as king. Jesus wasn't a king even for 30 seconds, no matter how many donkeys he rode into Jerusalem. But the next slide will actually show you the expectation from Zechariah, what it meant to be a victorious king. So if you read the context, we can go, the next verse, verse 10, says, he will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he will command peace to the nations. His dominion will be from sea to sea, from the rivers to the ends of the earth. So right off the rip, the prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9 is not about a dude that just rode a donkey. That's easy. I've ridden a donkey, I'm not the Messiah. Riding a donkey is not special. What's special is that you're actually a king, and that you defeat the enemies of Israel. That's why it says he's going to cut off the chariots from Ephraim. These are war implements. And the war horses from Jerusalem. And the battle bow. He's going to take care of all of it. And then even further down in the same chapter, when it talks about this king being victorious in war, it says the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow going forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet and march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. The Lord of hosts will protect them. They shall consume and conquer the slingers. They shall drink their blood like wine and be full like a bowl, drenched like the corners of the altar. On that day the Lord your God will save them, for they are the flock of his people. So Zechariah 9 has nothing to do with a guy who randomly rode a donkey into town. Zechariah 9 is about a triumphant, victorious king who is victorious over the actual physical enemies of Israel, that conquers the enemies and allows them to be safe. Jesus certainly didn't do any of that. He does not fit the mold.
And then, damn.
You might say to yourself, but we've got crucifixion. Obviously, the crucifixion, my friends, that has to count for something. Unfortunately, there's not a single prophecy in the Old Testament about anyone being crucified. Not remotely close. But what they're attempting to do is link the crucifixion from Matthew 27, John 18, and elsewhere to Psalm 22. And when you read parts of Psalm 22, you can see why they might do that. In Psalm 22, Jesus calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, when he's on the cross, Jesus calls out at the beginning of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. And this is a really interesting passage, because at first glance you're like, wow, that really does sound like Jesus, doesn't it? Well, certainly it would. The problem is that the scene that they are describing, while it is quite figurative, is pretty common. We'll touch on this in the next couple slides. The other problem is the text doesn't actually say they pierced my hands and my feet. That is a spurious translation. If your translation says pierced, the English translators who did your Bible are trying to do theology, and they're not trying to do translation. Let's look at what's actually happening in Psalm 22. In Psalm 22, David is calling out amidst his own struggles. And what he's actually saying is that he's being attacked by the enemy, and he uses all kinds of figurative language to describe it. Prior in the chapter, he says, I'm being surrounded by the strong bulls of Bashan. In verse 20, he says, deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. Which is why the translation in verse 16, where it says, they pierced my hands and my feet, you'll find in the Jewish translation and in the Masoretic text, it says ka'ari, like a lion. So the Hebrew phrase ka'ari shows up in the text, which just means like a lion, which you can see why that's how it would translate rather than they pierced my hands and my feet, because it matches the motif of what's actually happening. David is, like verse 15, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, my tongue sticks to my jaws, they laid me in the dust of death. The whole psalm is just this really beautiful poetic situation where David is likening his struggles. But the important part for Christians, they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. We'll address why this isn't significant here in a minute. But let's look at this problem with pierced. So I've kind of compiled a number of the sources for the text. So probably the most famous for the Hebrew text is ka'ari, which just means like a lion. Now, the second most famous is the third one, Ka'aru. The second one is like a lion, but it's in Aramaic. But the third one down just means they dug, like digging with a shovel. It doesn't mean to pierce. And the reason why a lot of English translations will say pierce rather than like a lion is because they say, oh, well, the word dug in Hebrew could be symbolic for piercing. They're making that leap for you. But that leap not only isn't necessary, it doesn't fit the grammar of what's happening, it's also, as we'll find out, a misspelling of a different word. The fourth option could be they defaced. It's another Hebrew rendering where the second letter is actually exchanged from an aleph to an ayin, so it still reads Ka'aru, but it's a different consonant. And then we got various Greek editions of the same passage. One meaning they dug, another they disfigured, another meaning to dig, another meaning they bind my hands and my feet. That's why the NRSV translations say they bind or they bound my hands and my feet. It's because of the Greek Septuagint Aquila tradition. They have this particular interpretive method, and then another Symmachus. There we go. The Symmachus translation or the LLS edition also reads bind. So that's why you'll find so many English translations can't agree on what to do here. And the reason why they can't agree on what to do with this word is because it's not correct, it's misspelled. In the earliest manuscript we have in Hebrew, the Necha Hever 5-6 scroll, what we find are two words here, Ka'aru Yadi, and both these words are spelled wrong, by the way. So, this is supposed to be the verb kara, which does actually properly mean to dig. The problem is karu is probably a spurious, accidental addition because the yod, the last letter in this word, got elongated. But the reality is, even without that, the second letter is misspelled. The aleph doesn't need to be there. That's not a proper word in Hebrew. So the reality is, we've got a word in Hebrew that's misspelled. Nobody knows exactly which word they meant to put there. It's either ka'ari, which would be a real word. It could be a form of kara, which is a real word, but it's spelled wrong, if that's what they meant to do here. So every translation you have is attempting to guess, what word do we think was here originally? Because what we have now isn't a real Hebrew word. And it's even worse because the next word, yadi, is spelled wrong. There's a spurious hey, that's the H-sounding consonant at the end of the word. Doesn't need to be there. It's not part of the word originally. It doesn't do anything. It's there by accident, right? The proper word in Hebrew would be the karu. That would give you they pierced. That shows up in Zechariah even when it talks about piercing. It does not show up in Psalm 22. Nothing in Psalm 22 is mentioning anybody getting pierced. The other thing too is the other portion of Psalm 22 that's important is this nonsense about dividing the clothing. Surely, like such a hyper-specific thing, how could that not be a prophecy fulfillment? Well, the reality is it's a common scene in the ancient world. When somebody falls in battle, the first thing they do is they go out and they strip the soldiers. In fact, we find even in the Bible references to this particular thing. 2 Samuel 15:30, David went up. Here's a picture of David on the run when his son is fighting against him. And it says, David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went, and he had his head covered and he went barefoot. And all the people with him had their heads covered and went up weeping as they went. So they're mourning as they're being chased away, but also David missing his shoes. Why would this happen? There must have been quite a battle. 1 Samuel 31:8 talks about the practice of stripping soldiers of their gear while they're in battle. So it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. So that's what you did when you had people that were captured or slain in battle. You took their belongings. That's why David in Psalm 22, obviously a wartime psalm, is saying, hey, they took my clothes. They're casting lots for my clothing. And we see David elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible literally missing clothing. And then we've got a really interesting text from the ancient world. This is actually a treaty between Tyre and their much larger nation, the Assyrians. And look what's really interesting in this treaty. If the Tyrians break their end of the treaty, look at the curses that befall them. It says, may they make disappear food for your mouth, clothes for your body, oil for your ointment, and may Astarte break your bow in the thick of battle, and have you crouch at the feet of your enemy, and may a foreign enemy divide your belongings. This is stock imagery. This is what happens when you fall in battle. They take your stuff, you're without food, and even in Josephus, the stripping of the armor and belongings in antiquities, referring to the battle with the Amalekites, it says, on the next day Moses spoiled the dead bodies of their enemies and gathered together the armor of those that were fled and gave rewards to such as had signaled themselves in the action. So what David is describing in Psalm 22 is not a prophecy. It's in the present tense. It's not even for the future. He's just describing his own struggles in a very poetic fashion, a scene that everybody would have known. It would have been very common. Everyone would know what was happening here. Certainly wasn't a prophecy about anybody being crucified. And that brings us probably to the most famous and final prophecy, which is the suffering servant. Now, I could spend an entire hour talking about this prophecy. I won't, because it looks like I've only got like 10 minutes. But I did assemble some passages that I think will help put the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 to 53 in the larger context. Because it's not really a mystery who the servant is. The prophet of 2nd Isaiah tells you who the servant is on at least 8 different occasions. And if you read all of 2nd Isaiah, that's chapter 40 to 55, it's actually really clear what's happening. The context is about the nation of Israel being the servant, and God is freeing his servant in order to glorify himself. He's going to glorify himself through his nation Israel, and then through the vindication of Israel, all the nations will know that he's the true God, because look at what he did with this people. So here's some passages that if someone comes to you and say, listen, we have a definitive prophecy that couldn't be about anything but Jesus. Surely we finally have one about Jesus. But look at the surrounding context. Isaiah 41, 8 through 9. But you, Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I've chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you who I took from the ends of the earth and called you from its furthest corners, saying that you are my servant, I have chosen you, and not cast you off. So right at the beginning of 2nd Isaiah, the prophet identifies the servant with the nation of Israel. And you might be saying, well, yeah, but, the servant is singular. How could it be a plural? Well, this is not a problem, because that's how metaphors work.
This is getting boring.
The second verse, Isaiah 43:10, you are my witnesses. That's a plural. You are my witnesses, says the Lord, and my servant in the singular, whom I have chosen, right? And so the grammar is not an issue. This whole grammar nonsense, well, servant is singular, so it must be an individual, it doesn't fit. Isaiah 44, 1 through 2, hear now, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I've chosen. Again, the servant is Israel. Isaiah 44, 21, remember these things, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I formed you, you are my servant. So, again, there's a reason why this is happening. Israel is named the servant repeatedly leading up to chapter 53 and 52 because the author, when he gets there, needs you to know who the servant is and what's happening with the servant. Isaiah 45:4, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. They're being called. Where are they being called from? Isaiah 48:20 tells you, go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea, declare this with a shout of joy and proclaim it, send it forth to the ends of the earth and say that the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. And this is the meta-narrative of 2nd Isaiah. This is the arc, that God is redeeming his servant Israel from Babylonian captivity. So we're talking about 538, 539 BCE. God is saying, now it's time to get up and get out of Babylon. I've redeemed my servant. That's the whole narrative of 2nd Isaiah. every last prophecy, every last word in 2nd Isaiah is dealing with that situation. Every last word. There's not a single reason contextually why you would go into the text of 2nd Isaiah and think that there's a prophecy here about the distant future, 530 years later, about a Messiah coming. Every last word of this chapter is about what's happening with the Israelites in Babylon. It doesn't make any predictions for the distant future. In fact, Isaiah 53 is not couched in hundreds of years later. It's couched as the voice of the nations, depicting what they have witnessed, the abuse of God's chosen servant while they were exiled among the nations. And so Isaiah 53 clearly is about the nation of Israel, both suffering for their own sins. In fact, 2nd Isaiah opens with,
man, look at this fucking
their
bullshit.
term of service is over, and they've suffered double for their sins. Why did they suffer double? Well, they suffered for their own sins and for the sins of the nations. Because when the sins of the nations, or when the nations recognize their folly for what they did to the servant, they'll understand that the reason why Israel was punished so greatly and then exalted was so that we could finally see the light, right? Their punishment had to be so severe so that when God does what God does, when he vindicates them, the nations will have no other response other than to say, wow, what a mighty, mighty God. I couldn't believe that this is what happened. Who would believe our report? Who would believe this thing that we've just witnessed, right? And so that's the context of Isaiah 53. There's no Messiah in Isaiah 53, by the way. There's not one. The only Messiah ever mentioned in 2nd Isaiah is King Cyrus. That's the only Messiah ever mentioned.
Man,
now, we could go into further prophecies. I think our time is starting to run a little bit short, so I put them on the screen for anyone who wants to look these up and read them later. I won't spend all the time reading them later, but they'll reiterate the same things that I've already said, namely, the Messiah is supposed to come, rescue the people of Israel, institute the Levitical priesthood forever, put down all of Israel's enemies, and bring them back to the land. These are all, and he has to be an actual king over the north and the south again. Here are the main prophecies that speak about that. So if you're interested, you can take a snapshot. I'll make, if there's somebody who wants, I can make all these slides available later to anyone who wants them. If there's a method for distribution, because I do have all these quoted in the slides, but we don't have to go over them now. But those are the most relevant of the messianic passages for the Messiah. So if you're wondering, hey, what does the Messiah need to do? Like, where are the real prophecies about the Messiah? These are the best ones. These are the ones you're going to find. And with that, I think we've covered as much as we could probably cover, and I think it's time for questions, correct?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We do appreciate it. Okay, so I do know that there are some questions. Are you able to hear me okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a couple hands raised already. Thank you. Thank you so much for an amazing academic and well-researched talk. That was amazing. So my question to you is, what is the most succinct and accurate way that you can dispute that Jesus is was not the Messiah?
Yeah, I think there are kind of two prongs that I would attack. First, the prong is I would attack, what did he do that would validate him being the Messiah? And I think the first prong that I usually attack is the prophecies, because if you have someone saying, well, Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfilled the prophecy of the Old Testament, the only thing you have to do at that point is say, okay, can you show me which prophecies he's fulfilled? And most Christians don't know. They actually don't know what he fulfilled. What they do know is like the hot ones that I did in the presentation. They don't know the more sporadic ones. They certainly don't know the ones that are kind of more hidden, like in John 19. So that's going to be the first goal. Is they don't actually know what he fulfilled. I think the second leg I would kick out from the stool is the resurrection nonsense. There's actually a lot of good ways to go about the resurrection. They're going to say, I know that resurrections are impossible. I know that they're unlikely. That's what makes Jesus special, is because we know it actually happened, and in fact, we have these eyewitness testimonies, right? So, what you want to press them on are those eyewitness testimonies. Who are the eyewitnesses? Certainly they're not the Gospels. Mark wasn't an eyewitness. First of all, we don't know that the Gospel authors wrote the Gospels. That's a very heavy burden to lift. They're not going to be able to demonstrate that. All of our earliest manuscripts don't have names. Those were added later. Like P1, the earliest manuscript for Matthew, there's no name Matthew on that. It doesn't come till later. So they can't actually tell you that the Gospels are eyewitnesses. The best they can say is that, well, there's somebody collecting eyewitnesses, like Mark. Mark, if it's John Mark, as we mentioned in Colossians, who's the cousin of Barnabas, if that's the case, then theoretically he could be writing down the attestation by Peter. Maybe, if we think Mark wrote Mark, but Mark certainly wasn't an eyewitness. Luke tells you he's not an eyewitness, right, in chapter 1. Matthew, certainly, I have no reason to believe that Matthew wrote Matthew. Not only that, there's some peculiarities with Matthew. He certainly, his conversion story is robbed from Mark, like directly robbed from Mark. He copied his own conversion story from Mark. And then he tells his own conversion story in the third person, copied from Mark. Why would an individual ever do that? It's such a nonsensical way. Like if you're writing an actual gospel from your own point of view, I would expect that your own conversion story not only has the most detail in it, but that you didn't just copy from somebody else. That's ludicrous. The other thing is, in Mark, it doesn't actually say Matthew is the tax collector. It says his name is Levi. So now you got to make an even bigger leap and talk about if there's a Levi and Matthew are the same person. But once you recognize that the gospel authors really aren't great eyewitnesses, like John 21 tells you, there's a multiplication of authors. It says we know his testimony is true. Once you recognize that the gospel authors probably weren't written by those people, like you still have even heavier burden to lift, which is like, okay, well, even if they're written by somebody else who's collecting other people's eyewitnesses, why do we care that they're eyewitnesses? For example, the resurrection in Aristeas, of Aristeas, was recorded in Herodotus Book 4. It was recorded by Pliny the Elder. It was recorded by Apollonius. It was recorded by Diodorus and Plutarch. So we've got lots of people, even some claiming to be eyewitnesses of the resurrected Aristeas. And so many people believe that Aristeas resurrected, and there were so many eyewitnesses that they made him a god after his resurrection. He was a human being that they made into a Greco-Roman god after his resurrection, and even set up a statue and a monument and a place for people to worship him as though he was a god. So, I mean, the reality is, like, if you don't trust the witnesses for the resurrection and deity of Aristeas, why in the world would we trust the eyewitnesses of the New Testament, especially when we can demonstrate that those same eyewitnesses not only misquote the Old Testament, they can't read Hebrew, and every time they quote the Old Testament, it's entirely out of context. These are the least reliable eyewitnesses you could ever want to invite to a court case.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justin. So this is Aaron. I have been thinking about this question for some time. So during the time that we're talking about in history, right, like back then, were there people who were talking about what you're talking about, like responding and saying, no, Jesus is not the Messiah and here's why, right, So that's number one. Like, were there people? Like, who were they and stuff? What were they saying? And then I guess part B of that is like, why haven't we heard about them?
I know, it's funny, they get buried in history. I think there are three famous critics. Some people would even include Trypho. I don't know, we could include Trypho. Make it four. But there are three famous early critics. The first is probably Celsus. Most of what we have from Celsus, it was titled The True Doctrine. Most of what we have is actually reconstructed from the writings of Origen. But you can actually buy a copy of the True Doctrine reconstructed from Origen's Disputations. And the second most famous is probably Julian the Heretic. He was one of the 4th century kings over the newly formed Holy Roman Empire. That wasn't an actual wasn't an actual believer. He was. That's why he's Julian the heretic. He wrote a volume called Against the Galileans, because remember, Christianity was a Galilean movement. It had nothing to do with the Jews in Jerusalem. The Jews in Jerusalem rejected it. It was a Galilean movement. So he wrote like a 70-ish page tractate against the Galileans, and it's scathing. He's the one that really points out the fact that the God of the Old Testament really was firm about you must follow these laws, even though he says these laws of the Jews were barbaric laws. But he says, listen, these laws are supposed to be here forever. And now we've got this Jewish Messiah that sends you to abandon all these laws. He's like, I don't see how this sect isn't heretical. And so Julian the Apostate, or Julian the Heretic, certainly would be a good resource for this dispute of, like, how in the world do you claim to be a Jewish Messiah having completely really abandoned Judaism proper? Another famous example of an earlier dissent would be Porphyry. So Porphyry was another interesting one, where he's basically attacking the nature and character of Jesus, kind of like Celsus. So Celsus does a lot to attack Jesus personally, like for example the miracles, right? So Celsus says that Jesus didn't perform any miracles. His mother was essentially unfaithful. She slept with a Roman soldier named Panthera, and because of this situation, she had to elope into Egypt, and so that she wouldn't get stoned for committing adultery. And then while Jesus grew up in Egypt, he learned the dark arts of the Egyptians, all the magic, and got a big head and came back to Judea eventually and started performing these magic tricks for people, claiming to be the Messiah. And so Celsus goes way out of his way to attack the supposed prophecies of Jesus, attack the miracles of Jesus, attack the lineage of Jesus, claiming, no, he wasn't of the line of David, he was a bastard child that they had to hide. Celsus is pretty scathing against the whole Jesus narrative, and his work is widely available. You can get it on the internet for free, you can get a written copy pretty cheap. And he's one of my favorite early critics. The writings of Porphyry are a little bit longer. It takes a while to get through them. You can get through the writings of Julian in a weekend. You can get through the writings of Celsus. They're a little more concise. In like maybe an hour or two, you can work through them pretty quick.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we have a question online. Why does Isaiah 41:8 say, "Whom I have chosen," when Elion apportioned Israel to Yahweh?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. So there's a within Israelite culture. It's been documented by a lot of people that study the Hebrew Bible. One of my favorites, Dr. Meyer from OSU, has a book that kind of goes through the shift in theme and ideas throughout the prophets, from the earliest prophets to the latter prophets, how their theology changes. That's Sam Meyer is his first name. So the problem you have in the prophets is their conception of God has to change throughout time. And one of the things that changes is their God goes from being like a regional deity of a clan in a particular land to a deity that is now over all things, completely transcendent, and there are no other gods. And the reason why their conception of God needed to change was because first they got devastated by the Assyrians, and then they went into captivity in Babylon.
God damn it.
And what do? Like, if you go into captivity under another god, so this would be, by Marduk, you either A, have to say to yourself, well, I guess our God got his butt kicked, or you have to say something like, no, this is all part of God's plan, we had it coming, God is even stronger than Marduk, he's Lord over all things, right? So you have this real strong monotheism start to crop up, where not only are they kind of moving from henotheism, where there's a supreme deity and lesser deities, they're starting to move during the exilic and post-exilic time period, suggesting that no, these other gods don't even exist. They're not even real. our God is the only God. And one of the shifts that you have to make during this time period as well is you have to start going into the literature and demanding that all of the other gods, this other God that we knew about, the God of the ancestors, El Shaddai, as it says in Exodus chapter 6, El Elyon, no, that's the same God. El Elyon is Yahweh. El Shaddai is Yahweh. And so we see this redaction layer in the Hebrew Bible where Yahweh is basically being redacted into texts that were originally about El, Psalms that were originally about Baal. We see all kinds of redaction in the text trying to make it so that Yahweh is the only God. Even though we know in the earlier strata of the text there were multiple gods, even they missed some of them, like Exodus 12:12, I believe, says that God is judging the gods of Egypt. So it's not until you get to the exilic period and post-exilic period that we have this idea that there's actually only one real God, the other gods are actually fake, or they'll reduce them to the role of like an created angelic figure. To be sure, the passage that you're referring to in Deuteronomy, there's another one, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, has a clear distinction between Yahweh and Elyon. And to be sure, the earliest strata of Hebrew history would have had Elyon and Yahweh as part of the pantheon, where Elyon would be the high god and Yahweh would be the god that apportioned, that had his own portion among the nations, among the 70 nations. That's why there were, in the Ugaritic Canaanite pantheon, there were 70 sons of El. Each one were over their own individual nation, and they're getting judged. In Psalm 58, Psalm 82, and Sirach 7:17, we learn about these other gods that are appointed over the nations that get judged. These are early strata within the Hebrew Bible that don't get redacted, but we've got a lot of late strata that do get redacted to try to make it appear that Yahweh is the only God. But anyone who's really studied the Hebrew Bible can see that they didn't do a really good job of covering their tracks. There's mistakes, plot holes, gaps everywhere. And that's where textual criticism and form criticism get to come in and have a field day with it.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. That was a great presentation. What is the scholarly consensus as to why Matthew tries so hard to put the prophecies in there while the other Gospels don't? And is that the only real reason? Because the other ones don't. But if the prophecies are something that Jesus did fulfill, why didn't the other people do it? The other Gospels.
Right. So that's a fair question. So, Matthew appears to be trying to legitimize Jesus to the Jewish audience. I think this is kind of important because most of the New Testament, if not all of the New Testament, outside of the book of Hebrews, is basically written for Greek-speaking people. Even John. John does some interesting stuff with Judaism, but over and over again, John refers to himself as outside of the Jewish people. He refers to the Jews in third person. The Jews, they did this, they did that, as though he's not part of it. Matthew is the only gospel author that is trying, it seems, to make a case for the Messiah within Judaism. And so that's why I think Matthew is the one who's noting, hey guys, if this guy's the Messiah, we have to root him into the Jewish tradition somewhere. He's got to fit. He can't just be some guy who showed up and performed miracles. We got lots of that. And that's actually what we find in the rest of the New Testament. We find basically miracle workers. And to be sure, if you have a Greek audience, if you have a Greco-Roman audience, a lot of them are pretty willing to accept your God just by claiming that they're special and they performed these miracles, because that was commonplace in their culture. In Greco-Roman culture, miracles were a dime a dozen. Even Vespasian famously healed a blind man by spitting in his eyes, and also healed him of a leg ailment as well in front of a multitude of witnesses. So, believing in miracles is pretty mundane, and it's kind of all you need if you're writing a gospel to the Greeks. If you're writing a message to the Jews, you have to step it up. You have to say, here's the reason why you should believe this, not just because of these miracle claims, but because of look at what God told you was going to happen.
Next question is, what is the story of how, when, why, or when regarding the Septuagint, and did someone in Greece get a hold of the Hebrew and then translate it?
Yeah, this is actually a really good topic. So, like, the most famous story of the Septuagint is told by in the letter of Aristeas. It's not entirely known if there was a person named Aristeas that actually wrote the letter, or if somebody attributed it to him later. But basically, the narrative goes that they down in Ptolemy country, they wanted a copy of for the Library of Alexandria of the Torah. They were making copies in the Greek language of people's different history and holy texts. So they wanted a copy of the Torah. And so 70, some translations, or some traditions say 70, some say 75, Jewish scholars went down into the kingdom. They translated the first 5 books of Moses there, and then afterwards they compared their copies, and they were all perfectly identical, which is hilarious, because if you know anything about the Septuagint, like, there's so many copies that they're not identical. In fact, give me 1 second, I'll show you. I've got, it's pretty thick. This is a copy. Oh, I gotta get my green screen down. This is a copy of my critical edition of the Septuagint. This is one of the newer ones. There's an even newer one out than this one that's like multi-volume, and you have to have like an independently wealthy uncle in Zimbabwe that sent you money to afford it. But the reality is, this document shows you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of differences between the various Septuagint manuscripts. To make the claim that they all translated it individually and then converted it and they were perfect, it seems kind of silly based on the manuscripts that were handed down to us. The other problem is it says that they only translated the first 5 books of Moses. We have no idea when the other translations came through. We don't know when Isaiah was translated. We don't know when when Jeremiah was translated, although we know for a fact that Jeremiah was being edited all the way into the appears the 2nd century. They were editing the book of Jeremiah in Greek and Hebrew for hundreds of years after Jeremiah was already dead. But the reality is the translations were eventually compiled into a codice, a codex that included all of what we would call the books of the Hebrew Bible. Most likely included apocryphal books, most likely included Baruch, most likely included Esdras, most likely included the additions to Daniel. The earliest one most likely included Enoch. In fact, even the early church fathers, I think Tertullian had a whole discourse on why Enoch should be included in the canon, because it's quoted in Jude and it's referenced in 2 Peter. And so we don't know when all of these works were translated exactly, except that we know that they were translated after the first 5 books of Moses. And they weren't translated very good. One of the earliest translators, Sir Lancelot Brenton, when he did his famous English translation, like if you buy an English translation on the cheap of the Septuagint, it'll probably be his. He makes translation notes. In his translation notes, he states that of all of the prophets that are translated from Hebrew into the Greek, that Isaiah was the one that was translated the worst and most sloppily.